Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. So for this week, I had a lot of different topics in mind for the episode. For example, the stress-mitochondria connection, how B vitamins, taurine, and magnesium fuel your energy, or a world without religion, freedom, or fragmentation, how emotional trauma contributes to chronic pain, or the social media dilemma, how to break free from the digital grip. But then a new development landed right in my lap, and one that perfectly encapsulates the concerning trends that I've been observing in the deconstruction, ex-Christian, anti-MLM, and ex-cult communities. So my friend Brandie Hadfield, who I had on in season 2 from the episode From Serendipity to Scrutiny, and she recently blocked me. And why? Because I simply pushed back and asked questions. We had many private conversations in the DMs that were already raising some red flags for me, but apparently even the slightest bit of pushback was enough to get me cut off. And this isn't just about one friendship, it's about a much bigger pattern that I've seen unfolding. The deconstruction pipeline. So one of the biggest ironies that I've seen in the ex-Christian deconstruction circles is how quickly people flee a high-control religious environment only to land in an equally dogmatic, ideological space. This isn't just a coincidence, it's human nature. As Jonathan Haidt lays out in The Righteous Mind, our reasoning evolved more for argumentation than actual truth-seeking. We are wired for confirmation bias, and when we leave one belief system, we often replace it with another that feels equally absolute and now appears rational or liberating. And this is where figures like Stephen Hassan and Janja Lalich come in, because this isn't just about Brandie. These self-proclaimed experts on cults who ironically exhibit the same control tactics that they claim to oppose. Hassan, who is a former Moonie turned cult deprogrammer, has made a career out of helping people escape authoritarian religious systems. But when we take a deeper look at his work, this reveals such an ideological bent, it's hard to ignore. He frequently frames conservative or traditional religious beliefs as inherently cult-like, while giving progressive or leftist movements a complete pass. He has called Trumpism a cult, and is conspicuously silent on the high control tactics within certain progressive activist spaces. His criteria for what constitutes the influence, which is his BITE model, B-I-T-E, this seems to shift depending on the political context, making his framework less about critical thinking and more about reinforcement of his preferred ideological narrative. And I did what Hassan won't. I used his own model to break down the mind control tactics of the extreme left, so check that link out in the show notes. Janja Lalich follows a similar pattern. A supposedly former Marxist-Leninist, she applies her cult analysis primarily to religious and right-wing groups while glossing over the coercive elements in the far-left spaces that she once occupied, or still does. Her work is valuable in breaking down how high-demand groups operate, but she too appears to have some serious blind spot when it comes to this ideological echo chambers outside of the religious sphere. These represent a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Other platforms like Dr. Pete Enns from the Bible for Normal People, Dr. Laura Anderson, the New Evangelicals, Eve Was Framed, Jesus Unfollower, just to name a few, highlight control tactics when they appear in traditional or conservative groups but fail to apply the same scrutiny to their own ideological circles. The selective analysis creates a dangerous illusion. It allows people leaving fundamentalist religious spaces to believe that they are now free thinkers, while unknowingly adopting another rigid belief system. This deconstruction pipeline often leads former evangelicals straight into progressive activism, where purity test, ideological loyalty, and social shaming operate just as effectively as they did in the church. The language change sin becomes problematic, heresy becomes harmful rhetoric, but the mechanisms remain the same. Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations in the book Righteous Mind helps explain this phenomenon. Progressive and conservative worldviews are built on different moral intuitions, and both can be taken to extremes. The key to avoiding ideological capture is intellectual humility, the ability to recognize that no belief system has the monopoly on truth, and that reason itself can be weaponized for tribalism. John Stuart Mill warned of this centuries ago. He said the greatest threat to truth is not outright censorship, but the cultural and social pressures that make certain ideas unspeakable. Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt's The Coddling of American Mind echoes this concern, showing how overprotective thinking and emotional reasoning have created a generation that confuses disagreement with harm. And a guest I had on previously this season, Franklin O'Connor's concept of fake intellectual is particularly relevant here. People who claim to be champions of free thought while aggressively enforcing ideological orthodoxy. So in this episode, I'll be unpacking what I've seen in these spaces, the replacement of one high control ideology with another. Through my experience with Brandie, I'll illustrate how skepticism is selectively applied and how critical thinking communities can become just as dogmatic as the systems they reject. But unlike Hassan or Lalich, my connection with Brandie was personal, and that's why I felt this warranted an entire podcast episode, because what happened with her, I think, is a microcosm of a much larger issue. People leaving high-control spaces are only re-entering new ones, convinced that this time they have found the truth. Spoiler alert, that's not how it works. Let's talk about it. Blocked for asking questions? So podcast listeners, in the episode blog, there's a photo of the Instagram post that I'm referencing here. Recently, Brandie had posted on Instagram about DARVO, which is an acronym that stands for a psychological tactic where abusers deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender to avoid accountability. And we're going to break that down in a bit. And I agree that MLMs use DARVO for sure. But when I wanted to add a friendly pushback, that I've noticed that the anti-MLM space uses similar tactics to silence critics, especially those of us who are questioning the food industry. But unfortunately, she had turned the comments off. Womp womp. So I went to Substack, wrote a note, tagged her in it, and asked, let's have a discussion. You can read the note below. And that's when she blocked me. Not for being aggressive, not for being rude, but just for questioning her narrative. So much for open conversation, huh, Brandie? All right, DARVO, the classic manipulation tactic. Okay, so we already broke down it stands for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. So this tactic frequently used by abusers, cult leaders, and high control groups when they're called out. What it does is it flips accountability on its head, making the person asking legitimate questions seem like they're the aggressor, while the actual manipulator plays the victim. So, for example, let's talk about how multi-level marketing schemes thrive on DARVO because, well, their entire business model is built on deception. So here's a classic example. Number one, deny. A distributor is confronted with the fact that 99% of people in MLMs are going to lose money. Instead of addressing the data, they'll just deny it completely. That's just a myth. I know tons of people that make six figures. Number two, attack. When pressed further, they'll go on the offensive, accusing the skeptic of being negative or jealous. Wow, you're just so close-minded. No wonder you're not successful. Reverse victim and offender. So finally, they're going to paint themselves as the victim and the questioner as the bully. I'm just a woman trying to build a business that empowers others. Why are you trying to tear me down? Do you see how this tactic shuts down meaningful discussion and keeps people trapped in a system that actually exploits them? Do you know what else exploits individuals? Fear and propaganda. I saw this firsthand in a recent conversation with a friend who is deeply entrenched in leftist ideologies and what we know as Trump derangement syndrome. She had shared a post warning people to change their bank accounts because of a false claim that Elon Musk's staff had access to personal financial data. I pointed out that this post was fear-mongering and was misinformation, but instead of engaging with the facts, the conversation quickly shifted in the way that mirrors a DARVO tactic. First, she denied that the post could be harmful or misleading. Then, she attacked me for not understanding the larger fear that people are feeling in the current political climate. Finally, she reversed the roles, casting herself as the victim of a chaotic world and me being the one creating unnecessary tension by questioning the post. This is a textbook example of DARVO, a tactic that deflects accountability, shifts blame, and keeps people trapped in fear-driven narratives. It keeps them from having honest conversations and prevents any real understanding of what's going on around them. Let's talk about how Brandie used the DARVO technique on me. Ironically, despite being an anti-MLM advocate, she uses the same exact manipulation tactics when I push back on some of her positions. Number 1, deny. When I questioned her promotion of dietitians who endorse processed foods like Cliff Z bars, which recently faced a class action lawsuit for misleading health claims, she refused to acknowledge the legitimate concerns. Instead, she dismissed it by claiming that caring about food ingredients was more stressful for the body than just eating the food itself, which is a false dichotomy that undermines any nuance in the conversation, especially when she often critiques the same logical fallacy and other context. Number 2, rather than engaging with my points, she made it personal, implying that I was being antagonistic or in bad faith for even questioning her stance. And number 3, reverse victim and offender. So finally, when I didn't back down, I just created the note on Substack and tried to engage with her there. She blocked me, flipping the narrative to make it seem like I was the one causing harm simply by asking questions and trying to have a conversation. When therapy becomes thought control, the weaponization of mental health sources. So what makes this dynamic even more interesting is that both my friend from Portland, who is doing the Elon Musk Social Security scare, and Brandie, the anti-MLM advocate, are therapists. These conversations have all unfolded within a culture that professes to value feelings, emotional well-being, and mental health awareness. More and more people are going to therapy than ever, and an increasing number of people are trained to become therapists, mostly women. Currently, around 70 to 80% of psychologists and therapists are female, and those seeking help are also most likely to be female. The therapeutic field has increasingly become a vehicle for ideological activism. Dr. Roger McFillin has spoken extensively about the shift, describing how therapy now often reinforces victimhood narratives rather than fostering resilience. Instead of helping clients process experiences and building coping skills, many therapists nudge them towards predetermined ideological conclusions, especially in areas of identity, oppression, and systemic injustice. This shift has eroded one of psychology's most fundamental ethical principles, informed consent. Clients, particularly young and vulnerable individuals, are often funneled into ideological frameworks without realizing it. Under the guise of affirming care or social justice-informed therapy, therapists may subtly guide them towards specific worldviews rather than offering them a full range of perspectives. What should be a process of self-discovery instead becomes thought reform, where questioning the prevailing narrative is framed as harmful or regressive. Therapy isn't just political, it has become a mechanism of enforcement. We see this in counseling programs that demand ideological conformity from students and therapists who blur the line between clinical work and activism, and in the public figures like Yanya Lynch and Stephen Hassan, who claim to expose undue influence while engaging in the very same tactics. This is ideological gatekeeping disguised as expertise. Rather than fostering open exploration, the field is increasingly defined by rigid dogma. Questioning the dominant ideology isn't framed as critical thinking, it's labeled as ignorance or even harm. And when that happens, dissenting voices aren't debated, they're just erased. And if this trend continues, therapy will not be a tool for self-improvement. It will be a tool for social control, like it already is. The hypocrisy of selective skepticism. So Brandie and the entire anti-MLM crowd, so far as I've seen, claim to combat misinformation. Yet they overlook a significant issue: the influence of big food and big pharma on public health narratives. On her social media story and in private conversations, Brandie has defended dietitians who actively promote ultra-processed foods. Some of these registered dietitians who have large platforms endorse products like Hawaiian Fruit Punch and that Cliff Z bar as acceptable or even healthy options. Cliff Z bars, as I mentioned, were recently involved in a $12 million class action lawsuit settlement because they falsely marketed their products as healthy and nutritious. Yet these bars are 37% added sugar, essentially sugar bombs. Yet the dietitian Brandie supports feeds these bars to her 1-year-old and 4-year-old, publicly calling them a healthy snack. Why is this not considered misinformation, Brandie? A deeper issue lies in the conflicts of interest within the nutrition field. A study linked in the show notes found that 95% of the 2020 U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee members had conflicts of interest with food and pharmaceutical industries. Many had financial ties to corporations like Kellogg, Abbott, Kraft, Mead Johnson, General Mills, and Dannon. Similarly, a 2023 report by U.S. Right to Know revealed that 65% of 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee had high risk or medium risks of conflict of interest with industry actors like Novo Nordisk, the National Dairy Council, Eli Lilly, and Weight Watchers International. Interestingly enough, both Cliff Z Bars and Hawaiian Punch, two foods mentioned in this discussion, are owned by Mondelez International, which is a company that has faced scrutiny over its ties to government, advising scientists, and other potential conflicts of interest. So this raises a very, very important question. How much of what we're told by credentialed experts is shaped by corporate influence rather than unbiased science? These conflicts of interest raise very serious questions about industry influence over public health recommendations. Yet, if you question this, you are labeled anti-science. And this kind of blind faith in authority is no different than religious dogma. The pursuit of truth should always leave room for debate. This also highlights why blindly trusting credentialed experts is insufficient. Degrees and titles don't guarantee that recommendations are free from corporate influence. Rather than acknowledging these conflicts, Brandie and her followers discredit those of us who are asking valid questions, accusing us of using the just asking questions fallacy. Well, what is the just asking questions fallacy? Well, it's a common tactic used to dismiss skepticism and is called JAQ fallacy for short. And this fallacy occurs when people imply that those of us who are merely questioning an issue, that is a form of misinformation or bad faith argumentation. You see, many dietitians and anti-MLM advocates are deeply entrenched in mainstream narratives on topics like vaccine safety, climate change, and pharmaceutical efficacy. When skeptics ask pointed questions about these subjects, they're often accused of jacking off, J-A-Q-I-N-G off, a term that suggests that they're sowing doubt without providing counter evidence. This accusation assumes that asking difficult questions is inherently like spreading conspiracy theories, rather than a legitimate means of inquiry. But skepticism is not the same as denialism. Critical thinking demands that we interrogate all claims, especially those made by institutions with financial or ideological incentives. Dismissing questions outright only serves to protect entrenched power structures. My counterpoint to that is intellectual humility and the dogma of data. So it is vital to engage critically with any information that we're presented. It's equally crucial to consider the potential pitfalls of blind adherence to any ideology, whether that's going to be religious, political, or even scientific. So I think in the modern age, science and data have often become the new forms of dogma. We dedicated an entire podcast to it. The scientific community, which prides itself on skepticism and inquiry, is now treated more like an authority, and it leaves no room for dissent or alternative perspectives. As I've written and said before, the worship of science and data as infallible can feel eerily similar to religious dogma. It demands conformity in the name of progress and dismisses any alternative viewpoints and often shuts down debate, all while asserting that this is done in the name of critical thinking and rationality. In this system, the pursuit of truth can ironically become an exercise in tribalism and intellectual rigidity. What is critical to recognize is that science and reason themselves are not immune to bias, corruption, or influence. Take, for example, the revolving door between regulatory agencies and the pharmaceutical industry, which compromises the integrity of public health policies. This conflict of interest is a significant factor in the mistrust surrounding many mainstream health recommendations, especially when we see how corporate interests shape the outcomes of clinical trials, the approval of drugs, or public health initiatives. Take the nutrition field, for example.
So let me show you what I buy for my kids, specifically ages 4 and 1. Okay, first up are these Z-bars. My kids really love these. They particularly like this iced oatmeal one.
But if you challenge this, you're accused of being anti-science or fear-mongering. Similarly, when figures like RFKJ highlight pharmaceutical industry ties to regulatory agencies, critics, they don't engage with that data. Instead, they just attempt to discredit the person who's asking questions. You know, the real misinformation often stems from corporate-backed institutions Linked in the show notes, public trust in physicians and hospitals fell from 71.5% in April of 2020 to 40.1% in January of 2024. And that's not due to misinformation, but people witnessed firsthand the contradictions, the shifting narratives, the financial incentives behind public health decisions, aka COVID. Those of us who were awake saw the bullshit that unfolded during COVID. The trust was eroded by deception, not by questioning. RFKJ isn't just sowing doubt for the sake of it. He's pointing out documented cases where pharmaceutical companies have manipulated clinical trials, buried adverse data, and exercised significant influence over regulatory bodies. In his book, The Real Anthony Fauci outlines a heavily researched case against unchecked power in Big Pharma and its ties to governmental agencies. And you know what? If his claims were false, he would be facing major lawsuits. Yet, his work continues to spark vital discussions. So, true skepticism means demanding better science, not blindly trusting authority. The real danger lies in silencing those who ask critical questions. Big food and the shaming of health advocates. So a recent study that came out in November of 24 revealed something that I find all too familiar. Intimidation tactics used by industries like big tobacco, ultra-processed food companies, and alcohol sectors to bully and silence researchers, whistleblowers, and anyone challenging their agenda. This tactic, used by big food to discredit critics, reminds me of the way people are shamed or bullied for questioning processed foods or advocating for healthier diets. If you've ever pointed out the risk of sugary snacks or fast food, you've probably been labeled an extremist, or a health-obsessed wellness warrior, an elitist, or a purity culture advocate. You know, I can't help but to feel that this is just another form of gaslighting, where we're told that it's way worse to worry about the ingredients in our food than it is to consume those ingredients, even if they are known to contribute to chronic health conditions. Ironically, this is the same kind of manipulation that big tobacco used for decades to muddy the waters around health risk of smoking. And now ultra-processed food companies are doing the same thing, distracting us from the very real, documented consequences of a poor diet. Why we need a blend of trusting ourselves, not just the experts. So what frustrates me about how the anti-MLM community will often jump on any wellness advocate who wants to clean up their diet for health reasons. And I agree that MLMs are a breeding ground for manipulation. But this should not mean that we ignore very real need to question the food industry's stranglehold on our diets and our health. I mean, it's vital to recognize that not all experts have your best interest at heart. Many of the mainstream recommendations we're told to follow come from organizations or industries with questionable motives, whether that's big pharma, big food, or big tobacco. These same industries have a long history of misleading the public, and many of their experts are bought and paid for by corporate interest. Wanting to improve your diet to manage or reverse chronic health conditions should not be dismissed as obsessive or extreme. It is a rational, self-preserving choice that empowers you to take control of what you can in your health, even when the mainstream narrative is telling you otherwise. Is this healing or just another high-control belief system? So Brandie often talks about cult recovery. Here she is in the podcast episode we did together last season.
Leaving. I've gone back to school studying psychotherapy, and I will begin my clinical supervision in September. So I'm super excited about that. And I'm really excited to work with people who are deconstructing from cultic groups.
She often talks about the importance of psychological resilience, but is she really modeling resilience? Because I would say true resilience isn't about avoiding discomfort or avoiding conflict, but it's about engaging with it, questioning your own biases, and standing firm in discussions, even when they challenge your worldview. I mean, instead, I think she's teaching people to coddle their minds, to create an ideological echo chamber where questioning the right experts is heresy, to avoid any perspective that might cause discomfort. If she's teaching people to avoid discomfort rather than work through it, I'm not sure how that aligns with the principles of ethical psychotherapy. True healing requires grappling with discomfort, Brandie, not running from it. When you teach people to shut down their discomfort rather than confronting it, I don't think you're promoting growth. I think you're just pushing them into another high-control belief system. And that's not healing. That is just another form of control. And let's be real. If your response to fair, thoughtful criticism is to shut down the conversation and block people who have supported you, you actually haven't deconstructed anything. You just built a new echo chamber with a different branding. The big picture. This isn't just about Brandie. This is about a larger pattern that I see in the deconstruction, ex-Christian, and anti-MLM communities. Many of them are claiming to be free minds and free thinkers, but in reality, they're just recruiting people into a different kind of ideological purity test. The message is clear. You're allowed to be skeptical, but only in approved ways. That's not intellectual freedom. That's just another cult. Oh, where do we go from here? We need real conversations about manipulation and misinformation, whether that's coming from MLMs, big food, big pharma, or an influential dietitian who profits from pushing corporate-backed narratives. And we need to be willing to hold all forms of power accountable, not just the ones that fit neatly into our existing beliefs. Because if we are not careful, we're escaping just one high control group, and then we're going to fall right into another. And that's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening. And if you have yet to leave a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple, that would be greatly appreciated because we are headed into the end of season 3, Taste of Truth Tuesdays. And I really appreciate you spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me, email me, find me on Substack. And until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.